in the I think it is helpful to have a large picture of what is happening in the book of Moses that Numbers especially is going to teach us. Numbers is very, very rich. I have really grown to see the significance of Numbers mainly because I have read teachers explain the message of Numbers. And what you have in your handout is the same chart or same kind of picture diagram that I have here at the lower portion of the whiteboard. If you need a handout, I have them right up here on the front pew or front row. And here we have the 5 sections in the book of Moses. We see that we have the primeval history of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is followed by the patriarchs, Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 50. And then we have the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, you know, in chapter 19, the covenant is made between Israel and God, Yahweh, through Moses at Sinai. And in chapter 20 of Exodus, what is given to the covenant nation of Israel because they have entered into covenant with Yahweh? Exodus chapter 20. The law. The law of, we tend to call it the law of Moses, right? But the law is given to Israel in the Sinaitic covenant. And from that point, there is this looming image of Sinai over Israel. And when you think about Sinai, and as we have seen that in in the journey, Leviticus sort of pauses and gives to us there an explanation of how God's presence is going to be able to dwell amongst Israel while Israel sins and God is holy. And we looked at what is provided in the sacrificial system, the priesthood, and the Day of Atonement. But when you look at this order, what you're able to see is that the journey from Sinai to what we see at the end of Deuteronomy, where the generation will die and the new generation will be on the brink of entering into Canaan, we have the wilderness. And the Hebrew name for, or the title for the book that we call Numbers is In the Wilderness. We call it Numbers because of the Latin Vulgate translated it for the census. So that's why we call it Numbers. But what we have is the law enters at Sinai and it extends through the second giving of the law in Deuteronomy. And what we read about in the latter part of Exodus, or the halfway part of Exodus, through the whole book of Numbers and through almost the entirety of Deuteronomy is failure. Failure. And this enables us, in one sense, to be able to see the big picture that is developed in the book of Moses. Is we clearly have God making covenant relationships and giving promises within those covenants. But we have this one covenant that has been this dominant covenant, receiving all of this attention from Exodus 19 through almost the end of Deuteronomy, and it's bringing nothing but failure in the life of the covenant people of God. Numbers, you see, sort of framed here by the giving of the law in these two junctures. Numbers is going to give us an explanation of the hope of God's people. And the hope of God's people will not be in Sinai. The hope of God's people is not going to be in the Mosaic Law. The hope of God's people, we will see from the book of Numbers, is going to be in the Abrahamic covenant being kept by Yahweh, and the Messiah in the latter days coming and bringing God's people into the land and ruling over all of the nations. We're going to see that in the greatest detail in the book of Numbers. So that's kind of the big picture understanding of what does Numbers especially contribute to our understanding in the book of Moses or the Torah. So we're going to unfold this for us. We're going to kind of narrate through the book of Numbers tonight, and we'll take next week to give an extended look at Numbers starting in chapter 21 and going through the prophecy, the longest extended messianic prophecy in the Torah. And so that will be our attention next week, though we'll touch on it today. Numbers teaches us that God's glory, that God is bringing glory to his name and the salvation of Israel as he promised, but through the judgment of Israel's sin. The book of Numbers is going to teach us that it is not those who rely on their own understanding who find salvation, but those who believe what Yahweh says. That's from James Hamilton's book, which Tim referred to it on Sunday, and Shelley went home with it for rent. God's salvation through judgment, or God's glory and salvation through judgment. We learn in the book of Numbers that God indeed, he brings judgment upon sin. 1 month after Israel enters into covenant with Yahweh, after being freshly delivered from his hand, or by his hand from slavery, God's people are empowered. They are consecrated. God comes to dwell among them in order to be led to the land and to live by his law. All right, a month has taken place since we've been learning what has happened in Exodus, when the building of the tabernacle, and the book of Leviticus has been given, or at least the message that Moses wrote in the book of Leviticus, that it has been given to Moses. That's a month period. And then we embark on what Numbers takes us. It's also very clear, and you have it in the very opening of the book of Numbers, is that Numbers begins to move. Leviticus, there's no geographical movement in the book of Leviticus. Exodus, we saw, was indeed all about the movement of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, and when God enters into the tabernacle that they constructed in the wilderness. The pause happened in Leviticus, and now Numbers, we begin to move with Israel again. So the opening part of Numbers is laying out for us, and I'm going to be very, very broad in explaining this, but the opening of Numbers gives to us, indeed, the numbers of the tribes, but also the order of the camp. And we see, not surprisingly, when we've seen the theology presented to us in Leviticus, we see that the arrangement of the camp is God-centered. And so here you have a version of it, I believe, on your handout. It would be on page 49 of your handout. You see that the order of Israel's encampment has the tabernacle at the center. So when they are not moving, this is how the book of Numbers teaches us that they are to be arranged. And in one sense, as you're looking at this arrangement, just as you could see it here, it would be like a map, so that you're looking at, to the very north side of the tabernacle, you have the 3 tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. But we've also been noticing, when you think about the most significant direction in the Torah, when we saw in Eden, when we saw in the exile from Eden, when we saw Israel being brought out of Egypt, what direction is God's favored direction? East. Who do we see on the east side of the tabernacle? We see Judah. Now, this significance of Judah we have seen already through the prophecy that was given in Genesis 49. In verse 10 in particular, we saw that it's going to be from the tribe of Judah that a king will come, and the scepter will not pass from his hand. But it has been a long time since we have had any explicit messianic prophecies in the Torah. But we'll find out later on that, again, explicit messianic prophecies will be taken up, and we will see again Judah will be mentioned. But the arrangement of Israel around the tabernacle is explained to us in the opening of Numbers, as well as how do they travel. When they are moving through the wilderness, there is a prescribed travel. We could go into more detail, but in general, you see that this is the order that chapter 10 of Numbers gives to us, that they are to travel in this way as they are going into the land. Now, there was even instructions for more details for how they were to travel relative to the Ark of the Covenant to be in front of them, and 3 days later they are to be following. But we can see, does God leave just the priesthood and the tabernacle and the Levitical system to an order, or does God order everything in Israel? Everything. Everything in Israel is arranged according to God's ordering. And so Numbers 1 connects us with the message of Leviticus in this way, as Numbers is continuing that this message from a different vantage point, as Leviticus dealt with God's provision for his presence amid Israel and fellowship with Israel, providing what it demanded, so Israel is to live wholly to the Lord. And in Numbers, we read of the Holy One among his people that will bring judgments because of his holiness for their unbelief and disobedience. We also see that God's presence does deliver them through preserving the next generation, but it will do so through judgment of those who do not believe. This will be especially clear in chapter 20. But Numbers opens with the order of Israel in both how they travel and two, how they camp, and the Lord is their leader. He orders them around his presence. He leads them through the wilderness. And so in that sense, all of the work of Israel is the Lord's work. We also are able to see in the opening of Leviticus that the Lord is their God and he dwells among them, ordering their life, but he also is leading them to where he has promised. So just in observing the nature of geography and that there's movement throughout Numbers, what is the orientation of the book of Numbers? Is it present, past, or future? It's actually future. All right. You're going to see it's going to deal with what they do in the present. So God will deal with them in real time. But the fact that Numbers is really just taking us through Israel's wanderings in the wilderness. As God is leading them, it is a future-oriented narrative. That often is not how we read the Torah. Christians especially tend to go back and we read the Torah, the first 5 books in the Old Testament, and we think this is just history about what has happened, about how God dealt with Israel then. And we don't think that it could possibly teach a message about what God is going to do in the future. When even the way it's structured, there's a future orientation to the way in which the whole Torah, and especially Numbers, is moving Israel to what God is going to provide them in the future. And this will come to a very dramatic and maybe somewhat strange to us individual who will tell of what Yahweh is going to do in the latter days. Numbers is going to have this future orientation of God's plan in fulfillment of God's covenant that is going to bring his people into the place that he has promised and is leading them. Around the tabernacle / tent complex, encamped the Levites, and they also symbolize that his people cannot come near the Holy One of Israel without proper mediation. And though the Lord dwells among them, he is not like them, and we are going to see painfully they are not like him. And so the one who bridges the gap with sacrifices for sin under God's holiness are the Levites, who will serve Israel in their priestly duties at the tabernacle. In this sense, it still communicates the nature of the relationship that Israel has with God. They indeed need a sacrifice that is a substitute, and they need a priest to represent them. The physical layout of Israel's camp with the people around God's presence as they move out of Sinai and toward the promised land does not mean that God needed their protection. Numbers 3 states the opposite. God is the one who will lead them. God is the one who will defeat their enemies in judgment and would return them victorious from battle to dwell among them. Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36 will say just that. And so the understanding of the arrangement in the very beginning of Numbers, chapters 1 and 2, is to understand the God-centered life of the covenant nation of Israel. We're going to painfully see that God is going to bring his judgment and mix it with mercy. This is the Exodus generation, and they will be judged, but the nation will be preserved. The Lord is going to visit the iniquities of this generation that is counted in the first census. And so, in one sense, the reason that we're going to have the numbers that are given to us, and we're not going to go through all those numbers, is because, one, you will be able to see whom did God deliver out of Egypt. We see all of Jacob's descendants in great number, which indeed, hearkening back to what covenant promise would enable us to say, maybe that is like sands on the seashore. The Abrahamic covenant. We will also be able to see and how many of that number will enter into Canaan. 2. A very dramatic numerical message for what does the law bring? And then we will see why does unbelief in the Mosaic covenant not actually bring about fulfillment of the promise. But we will see that though God will visit this generation, the Exodus generation, with with judgment for their sin, we will find that God will be faithful to his promise. And that will show up in a very strange, paradoxical scene with Israel's fear and fright and lack of faith juxtaposition their very enemy, Balak, the king of Moab, contracting a very false prophet to curse Israel and being unable and instead prophesies of God's blessing upon them. So we will see God's judgment upon this generation for their sin, and yet we will hear of God's promise and the preservation of the nation through the next generation. And we see this starting in Numbers 13, where we come to the unbelief of the spies. I think this is one of the places that we tend to, we're going to kind of go back and forth here, but in 13, the Yahweh commands Moses to send out the spies, and verse 4 gives the name and the tribes of the spies. And they are able to go and they search out, they spy out the land, and then they return. And the report is given starting in verse 25. Then they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days and went and came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they were recounted to him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruits. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we are surely able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land which we have passed through to spy out on is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night, and the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we would have died in this wilderness. And why is Yahweh bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Now, we can understand this in two different ways. Number one, we can understand it. Is this obedience to God's command? No, because they were commanded to go and take the land. At the same time, we can also understand, is this faith in God's promise? Because God promised them the land. No. Numbers will do for us what, in one sense, a right understanding of the gospel and of conversion does for us. Is it possible that one can have faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ and not trust God and obey? No. They're two sides of the same coin. If you have faith in what God has done for you as a sinner through the Messiah, who is Jesus of Nazareth, then you will trust him, and your trust will be manifest in obedience. Faith and obedience always work together. So where there is sin or disobedience, there is unbelief. Numbers will be presenting this to us throughout the whole nation of Israel, and even painfully through Moses. Here we see it in the account of the spies. God made the command, God made the promise. The spies go in, they come back, and they report what they've seen. And how do 10 of the spies and the whole congregation respond? Disobedience and unbelief. Disobedience and unbelief.
That's a quick question.
Yes, sir.
The whole congregation praised. Certainly it would not include Moses and Aaron. So what does that mean?
All of Israel.
But Moses and Aaron were not of that belief.
No.
So they're not, how can you say all of Israel in that case?
Because the way that it's rendered to us is you have to be able to make, how does whole congregation represent the nation? And yet we will see at least in this case, because Moses and Aaron are going to petition Yahweh on behalf of Israel for their sin and disobedience.
Israel, the congregation as like the federal head idea.
Yeah, we would see in the same way that we've seen, how does Israel enter into the presence of Yahweh? Through the representatives, through Moses and through Aaron, and then through the high priests in the coming Levitical system. So to understand the people is to understand that God has given to them representatives. And so in that sense, there is an ability, Jerry, to say, yes, we can talk about Moses as a part of Israel, Aaron is a part of Israel, but at the same time, we see that there is going to be a presentation of Moses, especially as the faithful keeper of the house, to use Hebrews language, and Israel is the house. But here, 14 tells us that the whole congregation of Israel responded in unbelief and disobedience, which again enables us to understand who was the covenant made with at Sinai. The whole congregation.
At Sinai, would they be considered a nation, a tribe, or how would you see them at that point?
Yeah, you begin to see the nation. Yahweh says to them, you will be what? My holy nation, a kingdom of priests. All right. So in that sense, they do become a nation, but there still is sort of things yet to be fulfilled. What do they not have at Sinai? What nations have to have? 3 things, or at least 3 things. You got to have a place, which means you got to have borders. All right. So I understand people think that this is crazy talk today, but all right, you have to be able to have a set definition of this is your land. Right. You have to have a people, and you have to have a law or a ruler. So when we come to the covenant made at Sinai, we are able to see they do have a law, they do have a ruler of that law, but they have a people, but they do not have a place. And so they are a nation, Jerry, but they're still, in one sense, a nation in development, because God has to provide for him all that he has promised. And they are yet to have the land. And they, in related to that, they have to have peace in the land. The inhabitants have to be driven out of the land. But here we're able to see that this is how Israel in the covenant responds to God's promise of the land in response to the spies' report. And so Moses and Aaron in verse 5, they fall on their faces in the presence of the assembly of the whole of the congregation of the sons of Israel, Joshua the son of Nun, Caleb the son of Jephunneh, and those who had spied out the land tore their clothes, and they spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If Yahweh is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. But as for you, only do not rebel against Yahweh, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has been removed from them, and Yahweh is with us. Do not fear them. It's good. That's good pastoral care, right? What do you call that? Just so we can also see certain things. When you respond with disobedience and unbelief, and Moses in this case, who is functioning like this pastor, along with Aaron, right? You rebuke them. This is correction. This is reproof. He rebukes them. So what now, in one sense, what is the opportunity? Second opportunity. What might, we sort of pause, don't read verse 10 yet. What might be the next response? Repentance.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe. the covenant people of Israel, maybe the ones who entered in with this relationship with Yahweh at Sinai through Moses, maybe the ones whom God indeed has dwelt in their presence and provided for them out of his mercy a sacrifice who will atone for their sins, and a priesthood who was effective to actually bring in purification of the sins of the tabernacle. Maybe they will be changed. Verse 10, but all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of Yahweh appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. Now we've seen when the glory of Yahweh appears in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel, is it always a good thing? No, it is not necessarily going to be a good thing. It was a good thing when he first appeared in fulfillment at the very end of Exodus, but it was then not a good thing when he appeared and brought judgment. And so verse 11, it actually begins, this judgment is now showing up with God's presence, but Moses steps in on behalf of Israel. How long will this people spurn me? This is Yahweh, verse 11. And how long will they not believe me? In me, despite all the signs which I have done in their midst. What does Yahweh say Israel's problem is? They do not believe. They do not believe. So again, the relationship to disobedience in Numbers is rooted to unbelief. Yahweh calls this the sin of Israel in here. So they wanted to strike Moses and Aaron with stones. Now Yahweh, verse 12, I will strike them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they. And you know, I think, what Moses does in response. Verse 13. Moses said to Yahweh, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for by your power you brought up this people from their midst, and they will tell of it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard you, O Yahweh, are in the midst of this people, for you, O Yahweh, are seen eye to eye, while your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you put this people to death as one man, then the nations who have heard of your fame will say, because Yahweh was not able to bring this people into the land which he swore to them, therefore he slaughtered them in the wilderness. So now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. Yahweh is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you have also forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. What does Moses petition Yahweh to do, and on what basis? Okay, forgive them. But on what basis?
Steadfast love.
Okay, and where was this taken from? Do you remember? Where did we hear this first? That's right. It was after their violation of the covenant that they had already entered into, that Yahweh declared that indeed he is abounding in steadfast love. He would forgive iniquity and transgression and sin to the third and fourth generation, and yet by no means would clear the guilty, but would visit the sins of the fathers on the sons to the third and fourth generation. Moses is appealing to Yahweh on the basis of Yahweh's covenant, character, and promises in the Sinaitic covenant. And Yahweh pardons them. Now, all are given mercy except for the most high-handed rebels. And here we would see that God's reputation among the nations in the covenant relationship that he has with Israel, both in pardoning their sin and in punishing their sins, is we could say, a public relations campaign that God is working through Israel in the book of Numbers. And so when Moses quotes from Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 here, he is just hearkening back to God's fame according to God's character, which was explicitly stated in the covenant promises with Israel at Sinai. And so there we can understand what is the ultimate reason that God relates to Israel this way. Okay, that's not the ultimate. It is the specific terms, but God has something else that he's achieving in that covenant relation. We'll say it this way, his glory. Moses is appealing to God on the basis of God's glory among the nations. And so the reason that God extends mercy through judgment is because God is committed to his own glory being manifest in his people. That's a really helpful lesson to get from the Torah. Because what do you think is going to, the prophets in one sense, what are they always going to be hearkening back to? When we read Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the minor prophets, they are going to be hearkening back to God's glory being manifest in his covenant people. This is not a development. This is, or it's not something new. It's something that has always been a part of Scripture. God is committed to his glory, and the reason that God extends mercy and judgment is so that he would be glorified. Numbers chapter 14, verse 21 makes this explicit. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of Yahweh. I have pardoned them according to your word. Why did Yahweh pardon Israel? So that the earth would be filled with the glory of Yahweh. And so that this is helpful theologically, because when you begin to think about things like forgiveness of sin, when you begin to think about one's ongoing relationship with God, where God extends mercy, where God brings chastisement, where God brings judgment, are those things sort of the end? Are those the highest reason that God is in relationship with people? No. God is in relationship with people for his glory. He is bringing glory, his glory, to fill the earth as he is working with the covenant people, the covenant nation of Israel, both here in forgiveness and we will also see in judgment. That God judges the rebellious in Israel, because we see here that God indeed extends mercy to them, and now they go on and they go out in battle and they are defeated. This is at the end of chapter 14. And in chapter 15, we see that they are given laws for what they need to do when they enter into Canaan. And so chapter 15 gives us these laws that are in between narrative sections. And then what do you see following chapter 15, which is a chapter of laws? The order will repeat itself. what happens right after God gives more laws to Israel, which the laws were given? What happened in chapter 14? Rebellion, right? So what happens in your house when your children disobey you? All right, they get some kind of consequence, but often it was like, well, but you didn't make clear, and you're like, okay, I'll make it more clear, and you add more law to the family record, right? And then what happens when you add more law? Well, then they break that law. All right, that this is not just your family. This is the way it is with sinners. This is the way it is with Israel. So we see following chapter 14 is 15, which is law. And what comes after law? Another rebellion. And here in chapter 16, Korah's rebellion, which is a higher handed rebellion from the first rebellion. And here we see 250 chiefs of Israel join with Korah in rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And their rebellion, while against Moses and Aaron, is ultimately against the Lord punishes them by causing the earth to open up and swallow them. Verses 31 and 33. And it happened that as he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up and their households and all the men who belonged to Korah and their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down to Sheol alive, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Then all Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up. Fire also came forth from Yahweh and consumed the 250 men who were bringing near the incense. So we are able to see that Yahweh, indeed, while he gave mercy, that mercy then was spurned. And so they rebelled again. And so God brought judgment to these high-handed rebels. In verse 41 of chapter 16, we read, but on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, you are the ones who have caused the death of the people of Yahweh. So how did God's judgment of the high-handed rebels of Korah's rebellion affect the heart of Israel? It sure didn't change it to make it soft and believing. They respond with unbelief and disobedience towards God's leaders. And so we're able to see God is working within the covenant nation of Israel as they're wandering through the wilderness through forgiveness and judgment so that his glory will fill the earth. But we are learning what is, in that sense, what shadow of Sinai is over Israel as they are wandering through the wilderness. A shadow of life or a shadow of death? A shadow of obedience or a shadow of sin? Sin and death. Sin and death. Right? Sinai does not bring life. Law is not changing Israel's hearts. Now, there's a most powerful part to this story, and that relates to Moses himself. Not only does God judge the rebellious among Israel, God also judges Moses. And so God's judgment, we are able to see, it does not pass over any. Moses indeed was privileged to be given the law of God and to experience the very presence of God in Sinai and in the tabernacle. And yet these did not solve the root problem with Moses. Moses did not inherit the promise of the land due to his unbelief in God's word. God commanded Moses to speak to the rock in order to bring out water, but Moses struck the rock instead. Consequently, the Lord did not allow Moses to enter the land promised to Israel. When you look at verses 11 and 12 in Numbers chapter 20, this is explicitly taught. Then Moses raised his hand high and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and the congregation and their beasts drank. But Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. So why did Moses not enter into the land and bring the people into the land? Because he did not believe Yahweh. Right here, we're able to see, to use, in one sense, New Testament vernacular. How is someone going to be justified before God? How would someone be able to be righteous in God's sight? And if you just think, what is righteousness? Righteousness is being counted as if you have done that which pleases God. And that which would please God, in one sense, you could say, how would one come to be counted as if you have done what God commands you to do? It's through believing. It's through believing. How do you not please God? You do not believe. Right? The relationship that we see with Israel, the nation, we see it with the leadership of Aaron and even Moses, is the reason that God judged them and they did not enter into the promised land, is because they did not believe God's word. They did not believe God's promise. The message of the book of Numbers is the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That for one to be accepted before God, they need to believe God's promise. God's salvation through judgment is indeed clearly taught in the book of Numbers. Salvation was for those who would trust God's provision for deliverance. In chapter 21, verses 5 through 9, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food. So Yahweh sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. Then the people came to Moses and said, we've sinned because we've spoken against Yahweh and against you. Pray to Yahweh that he may remove the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And then Yahweh said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard, and it will be that everyone who is bitten and looks at it will live. And Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on the standard, and it happened that if a serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. And we're going to unpack this in detail next week. All right. This is where what Tim was teaching us on Sunday morning in the class about, Tim, I don't remember how you phrase it, but you were teaching about how do you do biblical theology? How are you able to read the Bible as the Bible is continuing to develop its own message in more and more detail with reference to what it has already said? We're going to see, starting especially here in chapter 21, that this is indeed what Moses is doing. All right, we'll quickly make some observations. Have we seen serpents yet in the book of Moses? We have. All right, and what did those serpents bring? They brought temptation to sin and death from sin. And when in that sense you are able to see what was the promise that would come when God indeed visited the serpent for his sin, what was the promise that would come? How would the serpent be dealt with? The seed of the woman, and through the seed of the woman, there would be the crushing of the serpent's head. Here we are able to see that these fiery serpents are among the people and they are bringing death. How are you saved from the death of these serpents? All right. Now, Jesus in John chapter 3, verse 14 is going to refer to this exact thing. And he is going to say, when just as Moses lifted up this bronze serpent, we'll get into the details next week, so too Jesus must be lifted up. And we're going to get into the way in which we can see details about lots of details in the word choice here. From the serpent to it being bronze, to the word being lifted up, to a standard, and especially to look. And here we are able to see how was Israel saved or healed from death that would come to them from the serpent's bites. By looking to the serpent, and we'll see what that means, looking to the serpent that Moses lifts up on his staff, who is over Israel. When you look up to a serpent and God heals you, how is God arranging, in this sense, the salvation, your salvation from death that's due to your sin of disobedience? Because the serpents were the consequence of their sin. God's judgment for their sin was these serpents who came. If you look at that bronze serpent lifted up and live, why are you living? God made a promise. You will live if you will look to the serpent that Moses will lift up before you. It's faith. That is faith in God's promised deliverance. And here we're going to see that this is going to be a key point that will go further, that will lead us into the prophecies of Balaam. But here we are able to see that indeed the book of Numbers teaches the gospel of Jesus Christ. That God saves those who believe his promised means of deliverance. And Jesus himself said that he had to be lifted up in the same way, and those who look to him will be saved. This is not God operating in a new way. This is God operating in the same way that he operated among Israel. But we'll return to chapter 21 next week. Right? But what we are able to see right now as we conclude is, in one sense, the large structure of the book of Numbers is showing us from the covenant made with Israel and Yahweh at Sinai through Moses. Is it bringing the fulfillment of the covenant promise that Abraham made with Yahweh? Or is it bringing death? Right? We're not seeing fulfillment in Israel of the covenant promises made to Abraham. Moses and Sinai and the law are not bringing those promises. Right? We see the provision is sin is forgiven through atoning sacrifice. We see that salvation comes to those who believe. Judgment comes to those who do not believe. But we're going to see at the end of Numbers, and we'll see it again at the end of Deuteronomy, that Israel's hope is in God's fulfillment of his promises made in the Abrahamic covenant. And those are promises that hinge upon the seed of Abraham. the one who will bring a blessing to all the nations. And so it gets a little weird when we look into speaking donkey. But it is going to be a wonderful presentation of the Messiah from the book of Numbers. So come back next week and we'll go into a lot of detail about how the Old Testament, through the book of Numbers, teaches us that indeed Jesus is the Messiah. And it also, as we're going to see, the eschatology of the New Testament is the eschatology of the Old Testament. So, any questions? Jesse.
Just a question on the travel. I guess every time I'd read Numbers 10:33, I was reading that they were basically taking a 3-day trip. Right? Like everybody's going out together 3 days away from where they started, and then they stop.
Yeah.
And that is not what you're saying there.
No.
You're saying the ark is 3 days ahead of the rest of Israel.
Yes. Now, I'll tell you, there's four Old Testament scholars that I am dependent upon. So, John Sailhamer is the one who arranged the timing of how the travel works, and so I am persuaded of his understanding of the passage, which has the ark being carried according to the prescriptions. And so the Lord is going out ahead of them and leading them, and they follow in 3 days. So if there are other Old Testament interpretations of other authors, Jesse, I don't know those. So
I guess the English construction, at least in my translation, is not as clear on this topic as what you're teaching. So I didn't know if it was more clear in the Hebrew than it was.
It's more clear in John Sailhamer. So, and I'm not reading him writing Hebrew. So I'm reading John Sailhamer explain Hebrew things to me. So I cite him for this interpretation of Numbers 10:33. Eric.
What would you say to people that would say in Numbers 14 that Moses changed the Lord's mind?
I mean, I would say he didn't. We clearly have the Lord. The Lord is operating in relationship to Israel in a way that Israel understands. But I do not think that I think it is the easiest explanation is to say that the way in which Yahweh is interacting in covenant relationship with Israel is anthropomorphic, that it is like a person would act in relationship. And so that is the way in which engagement, like if you just do the same thing for us, when you let us say that you go home and you sin and you're angry and you're impatient, and then you confess your sin to God and you ask for forgiveness. Do you think that God in that sense is relating to you in real time to you, such that you're like, and I know that I am forgiven, for Jesus died for those sins? Like, do you think in terms of like that this is as you move through your 24 hours of the day and you relate to God in that progression of time through the day, and however faith and obedience or unbelief and disobedience unfolds in that 24 hours, and there is confession and repentance, would you in that sense describe that relationship as if, and the Lord forgives me, and I confess my sin to the Lord, and he was merciful to me, and I'm so glad that he doesn't draw away from me, but he draws near to me? We would talk about it in the same way. I don't think Moses is explaining here that God is limited in his knowledge or God is limited in his relationship to time and space. I think this is explaining how God is in relationship to his people. So that you have to hold these two things somewhat in a right tension, Eric, so that you need to understand, how does God relate to you? He relates to you in personal relationship through the covenant that you have with him in Jesus. So he's really personally involved in your life. So when you go through the day, you should talk to him. Thank you, Lord. I was talking to a friend today, and he was talking about how beautiful sunsets are every day. You see a sunset and you should say, Lord, that is glorious. Right? So you would that is the nature of communion with God for us. But does that mean that God relates to you just like a person, a human being relates to you? No. He's not bound by time. He's not bound by like learning things and then responding in response to other people's responses. So, Eric, I think theologically there would be a huge problem with thinking Moses changed God's mind. However, we know that Moses indeed is in relationship with God such that he represents Israel to God and petitions God on the basis of his covenant promises. And what does this, in that sense, what does the personal relationship of God and Israel right there show us? How does God relate to Israel? According to the covenant, according to his promises made in the covenant, according to his character that is manifest in that covenant relationship, which was explicitly stated in his forgiveness of sin and in his punishment of the guilty. So you can't erase God operating in relationship with his people, because God is eternal and therefore infinite in relationship to time and space and knowledge. You can't erase that way in which God is relating to his people. But you also cannot act as if God is not infinite in relationship to time and space and knowledge, which meant God actually didn't know or God changed his mind. So, Eric, I think you have to hold both of those in a complementary fashion that indeed seems to be maybe a paradox to us. But the short answer to your question is, I would say no. This was God's plan all along, and God had ordained that Moses indeed would petition so that God would be able to again state his character, manifest in his covenant promises, and that his glory would fill the earth, and thus he forgave them of their sin. That's a really good question. My answer doesn't really satisfy everybody's itches. All right, y'all are dismissed. We'll come back to chapter 21 next week.